What happens when we die? Despite all our scientific discoveries, the biggest question that has haunted humans throughout the ages remains unanswered. But there is compelling evidence that death isn't the end. In today's episode, we discuss two documented and amazing near-death experience accounts. All right, ready?
Ready.
Welcome to Shadowland, everybody.
Welcome.
This is a podcast that shines a spotlight on stories of the supernatural, mysterious, eerie, and unexplained. So weird stuff like astral projection,
Shamans, angels,
healings, black holes,
time travel,
holographic universe theory,
cryptids, weird science.
Oh, you've got weird science.
Visions, hallucinogens,
Ghost ships, cults,
past lives, creepypasta.
ghost semi-trucks.
Yes, all that stuff.
There is such a thing.
Yes. So, so should we introduce ourselves to everybody?
Sure. My name is Christina Callery.
And I'm Seth Jablon. And yeah, we love talking about all things sort of like supernatural and weird and mysterious. And yeah, we both love sharing these stories with each other. And so we just thought everyone else would like to hear them too. So yeah, that's why we're here.
And we're also, in large part, looking to hear news stories from our listeners.
Yes, we like to hear your stories and we'll read them. We'll read them as a part of this podcast.
Yes, we will.
Cool. So do you want to talk about today's theme?
Yeah, today we're going to talk about near-death experiences.
Or NDEs. Cool. So, great. Are you ready to get into it? You want to go first?
Okay, but you got to go first next time.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
So, my NDE story is it's one of the ones that it's kind of like, you know, one of the most notable ones that people point to when they're looking for actual evidence of an afterlife or of a consciousness after death. And just real quick for people who aren't familiar, NDEs are experiences that people have when they're dying or near death or when they're actually flatlined and, you know, dead and then revived. And we've probably all heard the cliches about seeing lights in the tunnel, go into the light, all of that stuff. And there's definitely controversy out there about whether or not these experiences are real or whether it's just some kind of fireworks going off in a dying brain. And we can definitely get into that in more detail. And just real quickly, there are kind of three different kinds of evidence for NDEs that really make a case for them being real. So one is NDEs that have been experienced by blind people, particularly blind people that have been blind from birth.
Whoa.
So someone who's never seen, who then has this kind of experience and is able to report actually seeing.
Oh,
that's definitely pretty strong evidence for there to be something else going on. The next one is when people receive information from individuals that they didn't even know had deceased and passed on.
Yep.
That right there, I mean, that's something that like is a really strong indicator that something else is going on besides just some random biological process.
Right.
And finally, there's what is called veridical data. And it's basically experiences that are verifiable by outside sources. And that's where my story today falls into.
Ooh, cool.
And it is the case of Pam Reynolds. It's one of the most famous out there, but I thought I'd start with this because it's such a compelling, interesting story.
Cool.
And
yeah, I don't know
really,
it, so yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Cool. Okay. So Pam Reynolds was an American singer-songwriter. In 1991, at the age of only 35, she started having these really strange symptoms. She had issues with dizziness, problems with speech, problems with movement. And so she goes to the doctor. She has an MRI, and it showed that she had a very large aneurysm in her brain that was close to the brain stem. And it was already leaking. So this was an extremely deadly situation, and one that would have been guaranteed fatal had there been no intervention. And because of the size and the location, she basically had zero chance of survival. Okay, so as a last resort, she was sent to neurosurgeon Dr. Robert Speltzer at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Arizona, who recommended this very rare procedure. And his words were, the aneurysm was very large, which meant the risk of rupture was also extremely high. And it was in a location where the only way to really give her the best odds of fixing it required what they called a cardiac standstill. And basically, this just means chilling the body, stopping the heart, draining all of the blood out of the head in order to be able to fix the aneurysm. So the person is, for all intents and purposes, basically dead. And then bringing them back from that. So this is kind of like some flatliner shit right here.
Mm-hmm.
So she doesn't really have much choice in the matter, and she decides to go through with the operation. During the operation, they start out by closing her eyes with tape.
Whoa.
And these are all important details because you'll be able to see like what she reports. It's kind of impossible for her to have done so in the state she was in. So they've taped her eyes closed. Her ears are plugged with molded speakers, and they're described as making this clicking noise that is as loud as a jet engine.
Whoa.
And they're placed in her ears, and they're basically, the reason they're there is to measure her brainstem function and make sure she's absolutely got a flat EEG in order for them to go in and do what they need to do.
Wow, this is pretty crazy. This is a pretty
it's crazy.
Yeah,
it's crazy. It's a crazy operation. I mean, it's something that's like, I can't even believe they did this in the 90s. But obviously she survives. But here's what she said she experienced. So at first she blanked out. They injected her in the IV with the drugs, put her out. So there's this lapse in time. But then she is conscious again, and she becomes aware of a musical tone. And she's a musician, so I think it's interesting that she referred to it as a musical tone. She said she describes it as a D note. And at that point in time, she started to like float up and leave her body. And here's a quote. So the further out of my body that I got, the more clear the tone became. I had the impression it was like a road, a frequency that you go on. I remember seeing several things in the operating room when I was looking down. It was the most aware that I think I have ever been in my entire life. It was brighter and more focused and clearer than normal vision. There was so much in the operating room that I didn't recognize in so many people. And I just want to say that's something, if you do any research into near-death experiences, that comes up again and again and again, where people, because there's an argument, are they having some kind of weird hallucination? But the clarity, I mean, generally it's described as more vivid and more intense and more real than what you experience in day-to-day life.
And some of this is definitely when they're just straight up dead, like
straight up flatline dead. Yes.
Right.
And that's why I chose this one, because people have near-death experiences and they're kind of like, I'm kind of like a near-death snob.
Okay.
Where they're like, oh, the car was flipping over and I saw my life pass before me. It's like, hey, you weren't dead. Whatever. But she was, 60 degree, 50 degree body temperature, flatlined. She was absolutely, as close to death as you can be. So she then noticed that she saw her body on the table and recognized it, but she's floating up from a place above it. And one of the details that was later confirmed that she saw was that the doctors hadn't shaved her entire head to do the procedure. And then she also saw the instrument they were using. And here's her description. I mean, for people who are squeamish about operations, you might want to, not want to listen to this part. But basically, she sees the bone saw, and she described it as like an electric toothbrush, and it had a dent in it and a groove at the top where the saw appeared to go into the handle, but it didn't. And the saw had interchangeable blades, but these blades were in what looked like a socket wrench case. And she says, I heard the saw crank up. And this description was later validated as the bone saw the surgeon was using. And again, eyes taped shut, ears plugged up with jet engine level noise being emitted.
Right.
Basically flatlined.
Yeah.
Okay, you can draw your own conclusions. And so another thing that she heard was there was a female surgeon who was there who said that she said something about her veins and arteries being very small. And it was a female cardiac surgeon. And later on, she found out that this had actually happened. And the arteries in her right leg were too small, and they actually had to go into the left leg to find an appropriate artery to use. So they're kind of getting her into. At this point, she's not completely flatlined. She's just like on the way there. So the surgeon is able to assess the aneurysm. He orders that, okay, now it's time, we're going to do cardiac arrest. So at 10:50 in the morning, all of the blood was drained from her via tubes, chilled in reservoirs, and then returned to her body. Her core body temperature began dropping. Her heart stopped, her brainwaves flattened, and she's clinically dead. At 11:25, the heart-lung machine was switched off and the blood was drained so that they could remove the aneurysm. I mean, it's just so amazing that they can do something like this.
Yeah, it is. It's crazy.
So they do all of this. The operation took 7 hours.
Holy shit.
And, like, amazingly, it was successful. But there was no way, from our current understanding, that she could actually be conscious under these circumstances. She's flatlined. They don't have any brainwaves. Her core body temperature is extremely low. She's got her eyes taped. It's just crazy. But here is, I'm going to read a little bit of her account of what she experienced then. So she says, there was a sensation like being pulled, but not against your will. I was going on my own accord because I wanted to go. It was like the Wizard of Oz being taken up in a tornado vortex, only you're not spinning around like you've got vertigo. You're very focused and you have a place to go. At some point, very early in the tunnel vortex, I became aware of my grandmother calling me, but I didn't hear her call me with my ears. It was a clearer hearing than with my ears. I trust that sense more than I trust my own ears. And it's really interesting because when you read a lot of near-death experiences, that comes up over and over and over and over and over again, that people aren't using their usual senses to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
Right.
It's like a telepathy.
The words in their head.
It's a telepathy. So she says the feeling was that she wanted me to come to her, so I continued with no fear down the shaft. It's a dark shaft that I went through, and at the very end, there was this very little tiny pinpoint of light that kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The light was incredibly bright, like sitting in the middle of a light bulb. It was so bright that I put my hands in front of my face, fully expecting to see them, and I could not, but I knew they were there. I noticed that as I began to discern different figures in the light, and they were all covered with light. They were light and had light permeating all around them. They began to form shapes that I could recognize and understand. I could see that one of them was my grandmother. I don't know if it was reality or projection, but I would know my grandmother, the sound of her, anytime, anywhere. Everyone I saw, when I look back on it, perfectly fit my understanding of what that person looked like at their best during their lives. And these are, again, I mean, it's like hitting all the points,
Mm-hmm.
ticking all the boxes of like what a lot of your, you know, NDEs typically have happen in them. Um, so, and
Yeah, with
then
like seeing
again,
family members having their like, yeah,
seeing family members, seeing the light,
yep, the light. It's a big one.
the telepathy, um, and then also seeing people like at their prime,
Hmm.
essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then she says they would not permit me to go further. It was communicated to me that that's the best way I know how to say it because they didn't speak. That if I went all the way into the light, something would happen to me physically. That they would be unable to bring me back into this body. Like I had gone too far and they couldn't reconnect. So initially, she's okay. She's fine. She's okay with going back into her body. But then, and one of her uncles is escorting her back. So she comes back through the tunnel or whatever it is, and then she sees her body, and then she says, by the end, I got to the end of it, and I saw the thing, my body, and I didn't want to get into it. It looked terrible, like a train wreck. It looked like what it was, dead. I believe it was covered. It scared me, and I didn't want to look at it. And then it was communicated to me that it was like jumping into a swimming pool. I didn't want to, but I guess I was late or something because my uncle pushed me. I felt a definite repelling and at the same time a pulling from the body. The body was pulling and the tunnel was pushing. It was like diving into a pool of icy water. It hurt. So she gets back into her body, um, and eventually comes to in the hospital. Later, she was able to fact check things that she had experienced during the operation with the surgeon and with other people, other doctors, including the comments and the instruments they'd use and that saw. And also, she had heard Hotel California playing at
Oh
one point by
wow.
the Eagles.
Wow.
Yeah. So she fact checked that, and that was true. Um, and her experience is actually one of the strongest, in the
From
in
an
the
evidence
NDE
point of view.
catalog, right? Yeah, and there's something called the Grayson scale, which measures NDEs,
Oh
and
really?
yeah, and her score was 27 out of a possible 32,
Oh
and
wow.
the average is around 15. So, and here's another thing. After her experience, she lost all fear of death, and that's another big thing that tends to happen with people who've gone through NDEs is they're not afraid of death anymore. And she ended up writing a song about her experience, and happily she survived the operation. Um, and she actually died of something else in 2010. It was heart failure at the age of 53. Um, but she had this extraordinary experience, and it's actually been corroborated by different sources. So this is something that um, it's like one of the most famous NDE cases out there.
Wow, yeah, that's pretty crazy. Like all the details and the corroboration. It's pretty interesting. That's something. I mean, I feel like they know now that like there's definitely a consciousness lives on after the body dies. They know that to some degree.
Well, I think like the current thinking is that they've done experiments, and what they've found is that the point of death isn't as clear cut as what they thought.
Right, right. At least for a
And they
time, there's
found that,
still energy
right, right,
available.
right. So now I think people who have like more of a materialistic point of view are like, well, the individual cells take a long time to die, so there could be
Right,
brain
right,
function we
right.
can't find
Yes.
and all of that. But, you know, I just feel like they haven't really been able to solve where consciousness comes from.
Right.
And
Yes.
also, just like in an evolutionary sense, why there would even be something like an NDE. Because obviously, people are going to die, doesn't promote survival. you know, why
Yeah.
would that be built in to just have some fantastical experience at the end of your life? But they've done studies actually with lab rats that have shown that at the point of death, like just before, all of these fireworks go off in the brain, and there's this increase in activity. So something is happening at that point, but they really can't account for it yet.
And doesn't the body like lose a certain amount of grams or something? Like I forget what it is, like 32 grams or something weird like that, where it's like
Yeah.
you lose just this like it's a small amount, but you become lighter. Your body becomes lighter after you're completely dead by a very slight
Yes.
degree of some sort. I
Yes.
don't know if that's an accurate number or not, but
I've read that before.
yeah, but that's
Yeah.
something. I mean, like I think Einstein said like you can't really destroy energy. It just goes somewhere else. It
Go
doesn't
somewhere else.
it doesn't disappear from the universe. That would be like a black hole, or that So it has to go somewhere, and so we just don't know where. And I think it's interesting to think about these moments where we sort of see what you could call proof, or at least some evidence that there's something here is going on. But I don't know, I feel like last episode too, it's like no matter what we think about all that, whether it's proven or never or disproven, or we believe it or don't believe it, people still have these experiences.
They do, and
And
actually,
what does that mean? Like what
exactly?
what can that teach us? Not whether or not they're having them, but what are the experiences, and not letting them necessarily be proof in and of themselves, but at least why aren't we looking at the story as at face value? Like why this story?
People.
Why light? Why is it about light
Right.
and all these other things, family, and so that's kind of what my story is about. I didn't really go the sort of proving anything. I didn't know about any of these like scales or these different categories of NDEs, but mine was just I was more interested in the person that this happened to, and what happened and what his experience was and what it meant to him, more in terms of that than whether it proved anything sort of scientific or anything spiritual for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I guess if you're ready for me, maybe I'll do mine.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
Let's hear it.
Cool. So mine is the story of Ian McCormick. Do you know who that is? Do you know that story?
I don't.
You don't? Okay. So this guy, I think he was in his like I don't have a lot of like very particular dates and stuff about when this happened, and but he's definitely got out there. You can definitely he's talked on a lot of like YouTube. He's done shows, and there's a bunch of videos about him, and I've just read about him over the years. But basically this is like I don't know, like 80s or 90s or something, not that long ago. I mean, he's definitely still around, and he was living somewhere on some island in the Indian Ocean, and basically he was just kind of like a surfer. I think in one story I saw, one recounting from him, he said he was chasing the endless summer. He said he saw that film. It was like wanted to live that life. And so, he was basically just out there surfing, diving, just living that kind of like island life, chilling out, not really doing much else with his time. And I think one night he was, talking to some of the locals, and they talked about going diving that night. And so they all got into like a little boat, and I think they would go diving for things like crayfish and like little sea creatures or whatever that they would take down, and they would shine a light on them or something, and it would sort of stun them, and they'd collect them, and I guess ate them or sell them or whatever they did with them. But yeah, so they're out there in the middle of the night diving off this like little boat, and so he's swimming down and around under the boat with this light, and he sees this thing that's like, he doesn't exactly know what it is. Like he said he thought it was a transparent cuttlefish or some creature he didn't quite recognize, and also kind of sounds like he didn't know his sea creatures that well, but it was box-like in shape, and so I imagine you can see where this is going. He reaches out, and I think maybe it brushes past him, or maybe he swims by it, and then all of a sudden he feels this like electric jolt in his arm. He said it almost shook his whole body. It was so intense. And quickly realizes he's been stung by a box jellyfish, which is, I think, one of the most dangerous animals in the animal kingdom, right? One sting from one of them can kill you. And I think after that moment, he proceeds to swim through like a bunch of them. And he
Oh
gets,
no.
yeah, he gets stung
Oh
like,
no.
he doesn't really know how many times, maybe 2, 3, 4 times, comes up out of the water, freaking out. They pull him back on the boat and he tells them like, I think there's other locals in the water with him. And I think some of them are brothers or something like that. And they're freaking out. Like they don't know, what's happened to them. And, whether any of them have been stung. And they kind of quickly realize like, we got to get this guy to the shore. And so they take him in to the shore, but along the way, they're sort of freaking out. I guess they left some of them other guys in the water. And so they get scared about leaving their, friends and family out there somewhere. And so they just leave him on the shore. I think they basically think he's going to die. And so they're like, sorry, dude, we got to go, save ours. And so they basically leave him on the beach. And he's feeling his body failing. Like he can't, he tries to stand up and his knees give out. He's feeling his body going numb. He said he feels the poison entering his kidneys. And it's this really intense, painful experience. And he's just sort of lying there on the beach. And he says, at that point, he hears a voice in his head. And the voice says, if you close your eyes, you shall never wake again. And so that, he just said he had this feeling of like wanting to shut his eyes because he's like in so much pain. He just wants to rest. But after he hears that, he realizes like he doesn't know where the voice is coming from. He doesn't know what it's about. But he's like, he knows that he's going to die right then and there. And so he musters some sort of will to get up, manages to sort of marshal his sort of, toxic body into hobbling up the beach to a taxi stand. And he's sort of like pulling himself up the sidewalk. And there's a couple like taxi guys there. And they're just like kind of start making fun of him. They think he's just some like drunk white dude.
Like a drunk dude. Oh
yeah.
My God.
And so he's like, please take me, I need a ride. I think he's asking to the hospital or his hotel or something like that. And they're like, do you have money? And, he's sitting there in his like swim trunks or whatever. Like he's like, yeah, I'll pay you. And so they just kind of laugh him off. And we're like, he's drunk. And they start walking away. And then he hears the voice again. And it says, he said, are you willing to beg for your life? And so
this voice doesn't sound awesome.
Well, it's helping him. I mean, it's telling him what, it's guiding him. I think he says like, son, are you willing to beg for your life or something like that? It's reaching out to him. And so he again musters his energy and gets up and sort of like follows after one of the taxi drivers and like basically begs him to take him to the hospital or give him a ride somewhere. And so along the ride, the guy's like, do you have money? We're going to go to your hotel. You're going to get me money. He's like, look, man, I need to go to the hospital. Please just take me there. And the guy's just kind of like, I don't know, either still doesn't believe him or doesn't care. It's not clear, but basically drives him to the hotel and just drops him at the hotel, kicks him out of the cab and just drives away. So now he's standing outside of the hotel dying again, Oh
my God.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy, right? And
it's the worst day ever.
Yeah. And so I think someone from the hotel comes up and sees him on the ground and manages to communicate to him that, he's been stung by a box jellyfish. And I think this guy believes him and says, okay, I'm going to go get an ambulance, but then kind of disappears. And he props him up next to this group of the guys who run the hotel. And they're there playing mahjong and, drinking whiskey or whatever. The hotel's closed for the night or whatever. And so while he's sitting there, he's like trying to beg them to drive him or to give him the car or something. Because he just doesn't know if this other guy is going to come back. Like he's at his wit's end. He's literally dying. He knows he's dying. And the guys just kind of, again, brush him off and like laugh at him and sort of make fun of him. But miraculously, the other guy does show back up with a ambulance. They load him into the ambulance and he's on his way. They got him hooked up, to whatever they're doing. I don't know what they're doing in the ambulance, but they're trying to save his life. But they know they know he's been stung by a jellyfish. There's only so much you can do, and so at that point, he again sort of starts slipping away a little bit, and he starts seeing the scenes of what he described as a white-haired child, and he just sees this white-haired child sort of running around and living this life, and then it kind of occurs to him that that's him. He's seeing himself as a child.
The life review.
Yes, the life review, but it was specifically about that time in his life. But I just thought it was interesting. He didn't even recognize who it was at first. It was so alien. Right. Like I was a towhead too. Like I had white hair when I was a kid, but you don't normally, like if you just saw images of yourself at that age, you wouldn't necessarily immediately be like, oh, that's me. Anyway, so
that's interesting.
Yeah, so he's starting to fade. He's like, okay, I guess I see what's going on here. Like I guess this is me leaving. And then he sees his mother, and I guess she was religious or whatever, and so starts to encourage. He said he sees this crystal clear vision of her, and she starts. She asks him to pray to God, basically, and I think this story is often recounted as him, as this sort of atheist. And I think, everybody, whatever degree of religiosity that they have, like when you're dying, you probably like willing to go for it.
Right. Yeah.
But he's like, I don't know any prayers. I don't really know how to pray, basically. And then he starts praying to God that to give him a prayer. And so that's when he starts he said they came to him as like images, but the words, like there were lines from the Lord's Prayer or whatever. And so he starts, I think he started with like the line about like forgiving or forgiveness or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so he starts saying that, and then that voice comes back and says, he says, okay, I'll forgive whoever. And then this voice comes back and says, well, what about the taxi driver that kicked you out of the car?
Whoa.
What about the guys that wouldn't, the guy who ran the hotel who wouldn't give you a ride? Like, do you forgive them? And he's like, no. And he's like, like really upset.
He said no?
Yeah. But then he kind of like sees the sort of like error of that, I think, sees that like he's dying anyways. And so he's like, you know what? He's like, if you forgive me, like, I don't necessarily need to, I'm worthy of being forgiven, but if you can forgive me, I'll forgive them. And he said at that moment, he sort of felt released. And so he closes his eyes, and I think they get him to the hospital or something. But yeah, he can't hang on any longer. But in a way, I think he maybe feels like he made some peace or something. And then he finds himself now suddenly standing up, and he's in the pitch black, and he doesn't really know what's going on. And so he's like, what's going on? Like, am I,
interesting.
Did they turn out the lights? Like he said, his first thought was that the doctors turned out the lights accidentally, or the power went out. And so he starts feeling around the room, trying to feel for the hospital bed, and he's sort of moving around and he can't find anything. And then he's kind of occurs to him, he's in the total darkness. And so then he sort of looks at himself, looks at his body, and he says he's like transparent. And he like tries to like sort of touch his own hand, and his hand sort of passes through it. And that's when he's like, oh fuck, this is like, something's happening here.
Okay.
So
that is super fascinating.
Yeah.
Can I just say that
jump in, please.
This state that you are describing right now, where everything's like totally black and kind of like a void, that's something that you don't usually hear associated with these near-death experiences. It's always the tunnel. It's always the light. It's always, seeing the relatives and all of that stuff. But when you look into near-death experiences and you start reading a lot of them, and there's actually a website, it's nderf.org, and it was started by a radiation oncologist called, his name is Jeffrey Long. And for years now, he's been logging thousands of near-death experiences from all over the world. Basically, people go to the site, they fill out a form, they submit it, and they post it. I mean, it's like a no-frills site. But when you start reading through all of them, certain things stick out that go above and beyond the cliches. So it's not like someone is just kind of coming up with these scenarios. and being like, oh yeah, I saw the tunnel, I saw the light, and to me, like, hearing you tell the story and the part where there's this like blackness immediately after death for a period of time, that's something that crops up again and again in these stories.
Yeah, totally.
But
And
it's not something that's necessarily widely known, like there's like a period of some kind of void. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, and I want to come back to that because like I think there's something there in terms of, you know, people having different types of near death experiences or death experiences, and that the stories are a little different. And there's something in that. Now I'm going to come back to it, but so yeah, so you know, his is a very sort of particular experience, and we're going to see how it's, you know, very oriented in a very specific direction. But basically, yeah, he, as soon as he started realizes that he's in this darkness, his body's transparent, like it starts to occur to him like, oh, the lights aren't out, like I'm dead. And around that time, he's like, he hears another voice, but it's a different voice, and it tells him to shut up. And that
Whoa.
something like he said it like it smelled bad, and like something about him deserving to be there, like in the darkness, and so he said he felt something sort of sinister about it. And right at that moment, he said that's when he sort of saw the light that sort of came down. They said there was this opening in like the top of the darkness where this light came down, and it was almost like the light sort of pulled him into that opening, and it sort of slowly drew him out of the darkness. And he said he looked back down and he could see the darkness below him, but he was sort of being drawn up into this light, and this light was extremely bright, but you could look into it. That's one of the things he said about it. It's like it wasn't too, it was so bright, but it was like, it didn't hurt your eyes or something. It was not painful. In fact, it was like warmth. And so he continues, he goes basically is taken up into this radiance, and he's filled with this sort of radiance and warmth. And so at that moment, he hears the same voice from the ambulance, the one from before that was sort of helping him along. And it says to him, Ian, do you wish to return? And that's when he realized, like, you know, what was going on here. In his mind, he sees this, he starts to see this sort of being emerge. I think he said he started seeing with from like the feet first, sort of like lowering down in front of him. And he perceived, you know, whatever this energy or light was or entity as God. And that's when it sort of occurred to him that God was light. And he said that he was sort of penetrated by this profound feeling of love, and that it kind of, you know, sort of broke him open, sort of melted him. And he sort of realized he did not want to go back. And he described this entity or energy or whatever as being this like light being with like light shining out of its face, essentially. And then all of a sudden this entity steps to the side, and where it steps to the side, there's this another opening. And within that other opening, he sees this other version of Earth, as he described it, that it's this green grass, and there's like trees and like streams and stuff like this.
Whoa.
And like, it's this like idyllic view of Earth, almost this like hyper real, sort of like high energy version of Earth. And
like
that's
a heavenly version?
like a heavenly version of Earth. Okay. And, you know, and that's when he sort of says to himself, like, I'm home. And I think, so then the entity asks him again, like, you know, do you want to stay here? And, you know, I think, sorry, I got to move back again. It's 42. So he sees this, you know, idyllic sort of heavenly version of Earth, and he says, I'm home. And, you know, then the entity sort of moves back in front of the opening and sort of closes it back up and says, okay, now do you want to stay? And he's like, he basically says, like, no one needs me. I don't have anything, you know, I'm not married. I don't have any children. You know, I don't have anything back there. So I want to stay. And he says, as soon as he said that, he looked back over his shoulder, and he sees again his mother there, who's still alive.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's very sweet. And so,
Yeah.
and that's when he realizes like what a sort of, as he described a sort of horrible thing he's just said, that, no one needed him, and that, there was nothing to go back to. And so, he sort of in that moment decides, I want to go back. And so, then, the entity says to him like one more time, like, I've just given you back your life. And then he basically, he sort of starts to come to, and he feels this like someone sort of poking him in the foot. And he's basically on a gurney in the morgue
What?
of this hospital. I think he's been dead for something like 45 minutes.
Whoa.
And,
so they're not even resuscitating him.
No, they're not resuscitating.
He in the back, morgue.
Yeah, he's in the morgue, comes back to life essentially. And I think the nurse or whoever was taking him there was, maybe it's like a nerve test, maybe saw his body was stirring or something like that. Right. They do that for like nervous system tests, like poke you in the bottom of your foot or whatever. And ran off to go get the doctors. But basically had come back to life after like pretty long period of time.
They
definitely
weren't not normal.
Not normal, like, And so, this was, obviously a profound spiritual experience for him, in which he sort of then, turned from atheist to this sort of, adopted this, spiritual life that sort of followed it. And I just think that like, there's something really profound about this story, obviously, but also that, what we were talking about, his before about, his experience, coming to this darkness, and, there's these different types of stories that happen. Right. And, you go out there and read them. And unfortunately, like, when you get on YouTube and, like start reading about them,
that wormhole,
that weird part of YouTube. A lot of times people go straight to like, okay, well, this is proof of Christianity or like the Christian experience, or, it goes right to like, just like the alien stories too. It's like, okay, see, there's this story. Of course, aliens exist. And it's unfortunate because I feel like it shortcuts a discussion, right? So exactly. This was his experience, right? And I think there is something to be embraced by the face value of his experience, right? He saw what he perceived and experienced directly as God, and as this experience of this level of the universe that you would call love, right? And you can sort of take that as a religious experience or not, but I don't think it's like the story in and of itself, even if it's a story that comes from our upbringing or our own outlook on the world, doesn't mean it doesn't have value. Meaning someone from another culture might have had another experience, but with different imagery, but that's something behind it, whether it's energetic or truly is sort of religious, that there's still something there. Like, right. I think I saw somebody on like one of the YouTube things like, do only Christian people have, like life after death experiences? And I think it's like, these that are described in these sort of terms, but, the Buddhists, they, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they talk about the Bardo plane, right? That after we spend this time sort of, there's this period right after we die where we are sort of hanging out on Earth a little bit, and then we go into the light, right? And they describe the Bardo plane as this level of existence which is described by light, and that that you basically go through this journey, and that on this journey in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, you're met with these, they call them like these like fierce deities or whatever. And there's a series of prayers that the Buddhists do that have to do with recognizing these as all an aspect of ourselves, right? That they're masks, that they're manifestations of the self that we're meant to recognize as ourselves and grapple with, and so I just think it's interesting that like, there is a particular type of experience, and, whether, if you weren't brought up Christian, you would have that same experience, or someone from a different religious upbringing might have a different one. I found somewhere people were toured space with entities that had no, sort of Christian, sort of imagery around it. But either way, there's still something about being met by something of another level, something of another type of level of existence, whether it's a creator or creative force or one's family members, that there's obviously some sort of connection that we have.
Yeah. I mean, just from reading over different accounts, probably hundreds of these accounts over the last few years in that nderf.org site, other things that you brought up, like the feeling of finally being home, that's something that a lot of people talk about. And it seems like there are these main, almost like, pillars of experience that people tend to have in the near-death experiences, and then the rest gets kind of colored in by maybe how they were raised, their cultural viewpoint and the religious orientation or whatever. But there are some definite unifying things that you see again and again and again.
Right. Which is like there's all value to, again, like taking them at the face value, but also taking them on the principle, right? Like like that, this experience of light, and like, what does that mean? Like, why?
Right. I mean, it's just over and over. Light is such a dominant theme, it's and it's equated with love. And another thing that you see over and over again is that it's so incredibly bright, but it never hurts their eyes.
It doesn't hurt their eyes.
Yeah.
And I think anyone who's done any sort of, hallucinogen or psychedelic, knows that, like, that's also a theme that occurs there, like light as being, we don't, necessarily really understand what light is, but, that it's this pervasive energy in the world, and that, in the universe, and that, this guy's, one of his epiphanies, that God was light and that God was love, and that there's back behind the scenes of this universe, there's something there, that we can describe with these different terms, like maybe light's a scientific term, maybe, love is a spiritual one, but there's something there to be described. And I think that's what's interesting to me about these stories.
Definitely. Well, that's really cool.
Cool. So that was our second episode.
Yay.
So yeah, I guess we don't necessarily know yet what we're going to do in the following couple episodes, but
I vote for ghosts.
Yeah, maybe we'll do ghosts. I want to do ghosts, synchronicity. I would like to do synchronicity sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, maybe that'll be our third and fourth. So if people have any stories about ghosts or synchronicity, maybe we'll get more particular about the theme of ghosts, like aliens. We sort of started with towns, but yeah, we definitely want to hear your stories, and
and if there's anybody listening who's had a near-death experience, we'd love to hear that.
Definitely. What was the email address again, Christina?
shadowlandpodcast@gmail.com.
Cool. All right, great. I guess that's the end of the show.
That's the end of the show, but until next time.
Okay. Talk soon. Bye.